Hello and welcome to this video presentation for the Utopia series. I'm Paul Marshall and I'm author of the book Towards a New Actual Vision and co-founder of Open Heart, Open Mind, which focuses on life practices for personal and social transformation. I'll organize this presentation around theory and practice, specifically integrative metatheory, which provides a big picture of where we've come from, where we are and where we might be going. And what I call Axial 2.0 practices, which are designed to help us move towards a more eudaimonistic society. So with regard to integrative metatheories, I'll draw on some of the major 21st century metatheories, primarily integral theory, whose chief architect is Ken Wilber, Roy Bhaskaar's critical realism and philosophy of meta-reality, especially the latter, and Hanzi Freinacht's political metamodernism, which is a more recent metatheory. So all of these can be seen as attempts to understand and move beyond the modern and postmodern paradigms that currently govern today's society towards a new form of social organization and consciousness that has been variously defined as integral stage, which is integral theory and Jean Gebser's term, eudaimonistic society, Roy Bhaskaar's term, and listening society, which is Hanzi Freinacht's term. They can also be seen as kind of utopias, but relative and concrete utopias, not abstract utopias, which I'll discuss in a moment. I'll structure this presentation as follows. First, I'll discuss a few relevant terms like concrete utopianism and eudaimonistic society. Then I'll have a brief look at the current period of transition that we are going through, and especially two historical precedents where humanity went through similar momentous transitions, namely the transition to modernity some 500 years ago and the Axial Age. And then I'll have a look at two crucial moves that I believe are required in order to navigate this transition. First, establishing a radically new vision of human nature, for which I'll draw on and focus especially on IFS, internal family systems therapy. And second, a conscious promotion of psychospiritual flourishing and development, both on an individual level and a collective level. On the individual level, I'll again draw on IFS. And for the collective level, I'll briefly discuss and compare two recent political programs and manifestos, which are designed to help us move collectively towards a more eudaimonistic society, or a more listening society, or caring society, as they put it. Okay, so just to discuss a few relevant terms, we can start with utopia, which literally means no place, and which involves imagining ideal societies. And this has often entailed static blueprints, or has not been properly grounded in reality, and as a result has been rightly criticized for its potential totalitarian dangers. Then there's utopia with the prefix EU, which is what this video series uses, and that means good place. And that's related to the term eudaimonia, which is generally translated as flourishing, and it comes from the prefix EU, meaning well-being, and daimon, which is variously translated as guardian spirit or inner self, among other possible translations. But in general, it's translated as flourishing or human flourishing. And this was a very important term in axial Greek thought. Aristotle saw it as the highest good to which all humans aspire. And for Socrates, through Plato, it was bound to care of the soul and its virtues or qualities. And then this is obviously related to the term eudaimonistic society, which is a term that Roy Bhaskaar used to denote a society in which there were no longer power to relations, by which he meant relations of oppression and exploitation. And he defined it as a society, quoting Marx, as a society in which the free flourishing of each is the condition for the free flourishing of all. And its ultimate goal was to create the conditions whereby the unique singularity or dharma of each individual can be fully realized and freely flourish. So we're obviously a long way away from such a society, but we can use that as a kind of goal towards which we can aspire, and a direction towards which we can move. And we can do so through establishing a series of relative utopias, whereby we achieve ever greater societies with ever greater flourishing and mutual care and trust, and overcoming ever more subtle forms of oppression. And these relative utopias need to be concrete utopias, not abstract utopias. In other words, using a concrete utopianism, which is a term that, again, Roy Baskay used and took from Ernst Bloch, who was a German humanistic utopian Marxist, whose main work was the 3-volume Principle of Hope, which focused on utopia and the possibilities of realizing utopia. So, unlike abstract utopianism, concrete utopianism is grounded in deep structures or unrealized potential or unactualized possibilities in what critical realism calls the real domain, which underlies and includes the actual domain of existing reality. And one such deep structure, largely hidden deep structure or unrealized potential, is, according to both the philosophy of meta-reality and internal family systems therapy, or IFS, is a core spiritual essence to human nature, which they call ground state, that's the philosophy of meta-reality, or self with a capital S, that's IFS's term. And this core spiritual essence, according to these two approaches, possesses a number of qualities that arise spontaneously once the obstacles or constraints are removed. And I'll discuss that in more detail when I discuss IFS. So concrete utopianism is also grounded in the tendential directionality of history, which is a directionality that is not linear, and it's full of regressions and setbacks and sometimes even collapse. But it shows an overall directionality towards ever greater freedom, ever less concentrated leadership, ever greater values and worldviews which are more and more universal, and ever greater social complexity. So some examples would be, using Jean Gebser's terms, how humanity has moved from an archaic structure of consciousness to a magic structure, mythic structure, mental structure, and then on to the next stage, which will be an integral structure of consciousness, all of which correspond with a corresponding form of social organization. And with regards to socio-economic forms of organization, we can see how humanity has moved from foraging to horticultural, to agricultural, to industrial form of organization. And now we're going through the transition towards a globalized, informational, digitized society. And this transition towards a globalized informational society is beset by multiple crises, which exist in every dimension of social being, and also disorientation and confusion. And this can lead to either utopia, a relative utopia, or it could also lead to dystopia, with ever greater tendency towards authoritarianism, and or possibly even collapse, given the existential threats that that currently exist, especially climate change and nuclear war, which has been exacerbated in recent years by irresponsible leadership and cyber-enabled disinformation. This is what the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists referred to when they moved in January of 2020. They moved their doomsday clock to 100 seconds before midnight, which is the closest it's ever been since it was established in 1947, and midnight meaning termination. It's even closer than it was during the height of the Cold War in 1953, when it was 2 minutes towards midnight. So there are plenty of dangers in this transition, but also many possibilities as well. So it's useful to look at two historical precedents, which relatively comparable to the transition period that we're going through at the moment, which, as I mentioned, was the transition to modernity and the Axial Age. So of the two, the Axial Age was deeper and more foundational. It was pivotal and involved a leap in human consciousness, which in many ways inspired the second momentous transition, which was the transition to modernity. And the transition to modernity is in many ways dependent on this original foundational shift in consciousness that occurred 2,500 years ago. It was especially inspired through translations of actual Greek text, which went through several centuries during the Dark Ages, from Greek to Syriac, Syriac to Arabic, and then Arabic to Latin, reaching Europe through Latin in the 12th century. And then during the Renaissance, there was access to the original actual Greek texts, and that inspired a full Platonic and Neoplatonic Renaissance, helping the Renaissance itself, which then started off the shift towards modernity. So let's just look at the Axial Age for a minute. So the Axial Age, a period between 800 and 200 BCE, pivoting around 500 BCE, which it occurred in several areas throughout the world, or rather throughout Eurasia, at roughly the same time. And it laid down, according to Karl Jaspers, it laid down the spiritual foundations upon which humanity still subsists. So it occurred in four main centers, which were ancient Israel, China, India, and Greece. In ancient Israel, it witnessed the birth of monotheism, and also the prophet's passionate critique of social injustice and speaking truth to power. In China, it saw the moral philosophy of Confucius and Confucianism, as well as the more mystical philosophy of Lao Tzu and Chuang Tzu, Taoism. In India, there was the Upanishads and Bhagavad Gita, and later Gautama Buddha. And then in Greece, there was the flowering of philosophical rationality, culminating in Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle. And then if we take the Axial Age as a whole, it involved breakthroughs in three domains: the cognitive, the spiritual, and the ethical. In the cognitive domain, it saw the emergence of much greater abstract thought and logic, metacognition, and critical rationality. In the spiritual domain, there was a consciousness of being with a capital B, a higher realm, which was, in the words of Charles Taylor, affirmative, unambiguously affirmative of the human good, and also a recognition of identity with the transcendent, which in Vedanta was identity of Atman, which was kind of the human soul, and Brahman, the absolute. And then in the ethical domain, there was a move towards universalistic values, to universalism, an ethicization, in the words of Richard Gombrich, an ethicization of the world, referring here to Buddhism and its contribution, and also a moral demand to align the lower realm with the higher realm. And this led to a call for both psychospiritual individual transformation and social transformation, which is precisely what is required today for us to transition to the next, towards a more eudaimonistic society. Then, with regards to the second major transition, which is the transition to modernity, this also had many advances. For example, there was a focus on individual flourishing and dignity and human rights, and also a much more extended democracy than in the Axial Age, which was democracy in the Axial Age was basically confined to Athens and only to male citizens, whereas in modernity, democracy was much more extended and rooted in solid institutions. So that was one major advance of modernity. Another was, of course, its science and its scientific method, which led to huge advances in areas like in the natural sciences, engineering, medicine, and technology, way beyond what the advances of the Axial Age. But it also came with some downsides, specifically its suppression of subjectivity and deep interiority, i.e. spirituality, and also its hyper-individualism, a hyper-individualistic ego, which was pitted against others and the world and tended towards domination and conquering. And that has led to an enormous amount of oppression and also ecological destruction. And then within modernity, we can place postmodernity. We can see it as a phase within the larger process of modernity. And this also had both advantages and downsides, also pros and cons. So among its pros was it made a necessary critique of classical modernity, many aspects of classical modernity, and it also defended marginalized voices and, for example, especially in the 60s, like civil rights, in favor of feminism, a much greater ecological awareness as well. But it also came with many downsides as well, especially extreme variance. So it had an extreme judgmental relativism and a rejection of objective truth. It rejected all meta-narratives or big pictures, for example, like integrative metatheories. And it also rejected all hierarchies, not just dominator hierarchies, but also growth hierarchies, which are very prevalent in nature and include, for example, the structures of or stages of psychological development. So an Axial 2.0 position would take the best of the Axial Age, or rather the best of pre-modernity, which includes the Axial Age, but also indigenous cultures and their wisdom. And the best of Axial Age, which include its focus, its spiritual vision of human nature and the cosmos, its insistence on both individual and social transformation, and it's full facing up to human suffering, and we could add to non-human suffering, which was a very specific aspect of the very characteristic aspect of the Axial Age, and also the contemplative core of all the great wisdom traditions, which are all rooted in axiality. And to that we can add the best of, so an Axial 2.0 position would include that, the best of pre-modernity, also the best of modernity and post-modernity, and the best also of integrative metatheory and recent advances in sciences and in fields like psychotherapy. One important move that I believe can help us through this current transition is to recover the Axial Age's spiritual vision of human nature. But such a vision is difficult since it's taboo, basically taboo under the modern paradigm. And the word spirituality has a lot of negative connotations, but it's a given, such a vision is a given in the contemplative core of all the great wisdom traditions, and also is accepted by most of the 21st century integrative meta theories. Science also seems to be opening up towards researching some spiritual practices. For example, the subdiscipline of positive psychology and consciousness studies. And there are spiritual practices becoming ever more widespread in today's society. For example, mindfulness meditation is fully mainstream. Martial arts and yoga have been around for decades. There's a renaissance of psychedelics in the last 10, 15 years, especially in the last 5 years. And then there's greater interest in the zone or unitive flow experiences in sport, ecstatic dancing in raves. All of these seem to be signs of a spiritual attractor at work in today's society. And to that we can add the acceptance just in the last 5 years or so of panpsychism, a panpsychist vision in the philosophy of mind, which posits consciousness as a fundamental part of matter. And this is a huge shift given the resistance to it in the last decades. And we can also add the growth of spiritual politics, spiritual progressive politics, uniting spirituality with progressive politics, which has occurred also in the last 5-10 years, or maybe a bit more. And this is, I believe, is vital for us to move towards a more eudaimonistic society. So with regards to this shift in having a more spiritual vision of human nature, I'll just focus on internal family systems therapy, which provides such a vision. So IFS was created by Richard Schwartz in the 1980s, mid-1980s, and it's become recently very popular for a number of reasons. Well, first because it's very effective and it's a gentle psychotherapy as well as being a powerful one. And also in 2015, it was officially accepted as an evidence-based therapy. And it was endorsed by Bessel van der Kolk in his book, The Body Keeps the Score, in 2014, with a whole chapter dedicated to it. And Bessel van der Kolk is one of the the leading experts in trauma. So yeah, and it also involves a synthesis of two paradigms: the plural mind paradigm, which sees the mind as consisting of many different parts or subpersonalities, and systems thinking. So all of these parts are systemically related with polarized parts, alliances. If one part's affected, it affects the whole system, and so on. So IFS has a specific map of the psyche, which it sees as being divided into protective parts and vulnerable parts, or exiles. The protective parts, it subdivides into proactive managers who manage and control the individual and others and situations so that the vulnerable parts, or exiles, are not triggered and thus do not threaten the stability of the system. And then there are reactive firefighters, as they're called, which come into action if, despite all the efforts of the protective parts, the vulnerable parts are triggered. And Richard Schwartz came to this map of the psyche in a bottom-up, empirically driven process, not in a top-down, theory-driven process. Basically, he followed his clinical observation and what he heard and saw from his clients who suffered from trauma in their descriptions of what was going on in their mind. And so basically he just followed the data to wherever it took him, which is the definition of good science. And one place where it took him was to this deeper core spiritual essence, which he called the self, capital S. And he found that this self lay just below the protectors. So when the protectors started to gain a bit more trust and opened up space, then the self with its qualities would arise spontaneously. And so he found that this self existed in everybody without exception, was unaffected by adverse childhood or adult experiences, however traumatic, possesses a number of qualities, including compassion, calm, curiosity, clarity, connection, courage, creativity, and there should be another one. In total, it's 8. He calls them the 8 C's. And also, very importantly, that the self, with its qualities, was the entity that did the actual healing. It's the self of the individual who did the healing of its own vulnerable parts. And it did this by dialoguing with the parts. It does this by dialoguing with the parts with curiosity and compassion, so genuine curiosity and compassion. And this this allows the protective parts to relax, to gradually gain trust. And once trust is gained, then the self of the client can ask the protective parts to open up space and to give permission to access the vulnerable parts or exiles that they are protecting. And once the self has gained this permission from the protective parts, then it can dialogue with the exile, witness its story, and then take it through an unburdening process. So the self is the kind of the jewel of IFS, and it's what makes IFS unique and differentiates it from all other psychotherapies, which some may have the notion of a self, but they do not have the notion of a self with its qualities and its healing ability. And IFS is very, very closely connected to the philosophy of meta-reality and its notion of the ground state, which is also this is Roy Bhaskaar's philosophy. And the ground state is also the core spiritual essence of the fundamental essential nature of human beings. And it also possesses a number of qualities, including love, creativity, spontaneous right action. And these qualities also arise spontaneously once constraints or obstacles are removed. So they are very, very similar. They act differently. IFS is a psychotherapy, and philosophy of meta-reality is a integrative meta theory. And IFS releases these constraints to the self by relaxing the protectors and asking them to open up space, and healing the exiles, which then relaxes the whole system. And the philosophy of meta-reality talks about heteronomous orders of determination in every plane of social being, as Bhaskaar calls it. In other words, in the individual psyche, in social and economic and political structures, and interpersonal relationships. So these are another thing to mention is that both IFS and the self of the IFS and the ground state of philosophy of meta-reality are equivalent to the self of the great wisdom traditions, the actual contemplative core of the actual traditions, specifically to the immanent aspect of being with capital B. For example, in Vedanta, they talk of Saguna Brahman, which literally means the absolute with qualities. And so that would be the equivalent of IFS's self or the ground state. There's also, in Vedanta, they talk of Nirguna Brahman, which is the absolute without qualities. And this would be the more transcendent aspect of being. And that would relate in some ways to what Richard Swart calls self-essence, as opposed to self. Just self-essence would be the more transcendent aspect. And it's related to some extent to what Roy Bhaskaar calls the cosmic envelope, which is where all the individual ground states reside. It's kind of his secular equivalent to God. So IFS can thus be seen as a therapeutic protocol, as a map of the psyche, and also as a life practice. So it can be used on a daily basis. Once you get to know the model, and especially the map of the psyche, then you can use it. Anybody can use it to get to know their parts better, especially their protective parts, to have more daily access to self through a series of specifically designed meditations. And also intuition and even contact with your exiles as well, especially once you know the model and the psyche, the map of the psyche well. Although healing of deep exiles normally requires an IFS trained therapist or practitioner. So the IFS map changes radically our relation with ourselves. We can become much more compassionate and understanding towards ourselves, but it can also change our relationship with others. So we realize that like us, then others are made up of myriad parts, and some of these parts can hijack their system. Also, we realize that there are their parts have burdens, so we can see beyond their parts to their burdens and exiles, and that enables us to become more understanding and compassionate towards others, just like it does towards ourselves. And then we can also see that fundamentally the true nature, the essential nature of all people, all beings, is a spiritual essence, or in IFS terms, self, or in philosophy of meta-reality terms, the ground state. So shifting our vision of human nature is one way to help us transition through to a more eudaimonistic society. And another way is to consciously promote psychospiritual flourishing and development, both individually and collectively. So here, I'll first focus on the individual level, and I'll draw on Hanzi Freinacht's 4-part model of psychological development, which is a refinement of integral theories model of psychological development. So integral theory had one of its main strengths is its upper left quadrant, which deals with the interior of the individual. And it talks of, as well as stages of development, also lines of development and states of consciousness. And this gave a great deal of coherence to a disparate number of lines of development and pieces of research. But it also remained with many different lines of development or skills or different intelligences, which was difficult to apply practically. And another problem of integral theory's model, I believe, is that it never fully separated stages and states of consciousness. So they were always quite closely related. And one thing that Hanzi Freinacht's model does is it clearly separates stages of consciousness or development from states of consciousness. So yeah, it has a number of advantages. First of all, it's more elegant and more easily applicable in practice. It involves just four major parts. Second, it has much greater explanatory power. And third, as I said, it fully separates and this is the key, stages of consciousness from states of consciousness. I won't go into that in much detail. In a forthcoming book chapter, I discuss this in more detail. See below in the notes for details. But I'll just go through briefly the Hanzi Freinacht's 4 major parts. So 2 of them are stage parts, and 2 of them are state aspects. So the stage parts are, one of the stage parts is cognitive complexity, and this is based on Michael Common's model of hierarchical complexity, and it includes there's about 16 stages, and the 5 most common stages in human adults is he calls the concrete stage, the abstract, formal, systematic, and metasystematic. And then the other stage component is what he calls the cultural code component, or symbol stage component. And this refers to a person's values and worldviews. And it goes through stages that kind of roughly correspond to the stages of cognitive complexity, although there's no absolute connection there. And these are called, well, they're the warrior stage, or what Freinacht calls Faustian, traditional or post-Faustian stage, then modern, postmodern, and metamodern stages. Okay, so those are the 2 stage components. Then there's 2 states components. One is subjective states, and this involves a whole spectrum of emotional states, which go from low, which could include tormented, tortured states, to middle, which would be, for example, feeling of unease or anxiety, then to feeling okay or fine or content and even joyful. And then in the higher states, that would include more spiritual states like bliss states or unitive flow states. And the other state component is depth, which is basically involves the the degree of embodiment and integration of emotional states, of varying emotional states, and also to the how much reality a person can see and how deeply into the reality a person can see. So with those four parts together form what Hanzi Freinacht calls the effective value meme. And this is basically a combination of qualities and aspects of each of those four components. And he describes it as an overall pattern of mind, kind of an equilibrium point at which a person's values and worldviews tend to stabilize. And it also it helps understand a person's general psychology and their political psychology and behavior. And this is important in today's world, and especially in the current transition that we're moving through and multiple crises, because to some extent, to a large extent, in fact, the multiple crises that we're living through, like, for example, the increasing polarization and culture wars, are a result of people being established, stabilized at different effective value memes, both within countries and between countries. And also the fact that most people have effective memes that are earlier than the effective meme to which the current world system corresponds. So in that sense, this is a very useful model to help understand ourselves and the situation that we're in at the moment. And so I'd like to focus again on IFS and how IFS can help enhance or improve psychospiritual flourishing and development, focusing on each of these four components. So the first component, let's take subjective states. This is the component that can most easily be affected by a psychotherapy like IFS. And in fact, psychotherapy, along with meditation, are the classical means by which to improve a person's subjective states. Meditation, for example, is a classic means, and there's a huge research in meditation and mindfulness meditation, which shows the benefits, not just in psychological well-being, but also in physical health, longevity, cognition, and a whole host of positive effects. So one way to improve the subjective states component of Freinacht's model is to meditate, because it's impeccably based on evidence. And but for example, for well, let's just say what meditation does is it gets a person into the witness position, which observes and accepts and welcomes all emotions and thoughts and sensations that arise without judgment. And this has a general, including negative, so-called negative and destructive emotions, just accepting them. And this helps reduce anxiety and calm the whole system down. And this is something to be very much to be welcomed. But according to IFS, this is just an important first step. Because one thing that IFS has is that it has this plural mind paradigm. So it sees the psyche as being made up of many different parts. And so whereas in general, in meditation and in the spiritual traditions, then the negative or destructive emotions, as they're called, are seen as afflictions and something that needs to be some part of the ego which needs to be transcended. IFS sees them as emanations of parts. And the idea of ISS is to follow these emanations, so the emotions and difficult emotions and thoughts that occur, and follow them to their parts. And then from there, dialogue with the parts with genuine curiosity, gain their trust, ask them to permission to access to the exiles or vulnerable parts that they're protecting, and then go through the unburdening process and thus relax the whole system. So that's one way in which IFS can help heal vulnerable parts, and as a result relax and calm the whole system down. And this can have a very strong impact on a person's subjective states and daily sense of being. You know, if it can just move from one, let's say, a state of anxiety to one of feeling okay, that is a huge shift. And then you can go from, for example, feeling okay to a more stable sense of feeling content. And this has a huge effect on a person's well-being. Another component is cognitive complexity, and that can be helped by IFS. Not so much because its cognitive complexity seems to be generally inherited, but because emotions and cognition are so intricately intertwined, then affecting one's emotional states and healing the whole system, then that can have a positive effect on cognition and cognitive complexity. And then another way that it can help in the cognitive complexity component is that IFS has seen that many of the exiles are frozen at the age and stage of development when the trauma or adverse childhood experience occurred. And so by accessing these exiles, after asking protectors to open up space and give you permission, by accessing these exiles and unburdening them, then they can be released and unfrozen and take on their natural roles and come to the present. And that can have a big effect on the developmental drag that such frozen parts have on the whole system. Then on the depth component, but the depth component involved embodying and integrating intense emotional parts or emotional states. And so by going through the IFS process and witnessing these, especially the intense states of the exiles, then they can be gradually integrated into the whole system and take on new roles. But those states will be experienced and embodied and integrated, and that will increase a person's depth in Freinacht's definition. Also, it gives us a deeper vision of ourself and our spiritual essence and of others. So that opens us up. It also opens us up to the general spiritual nature and the general vulnerability of all of us. And that also can increase a person's depth as one connects more to general human suffering and non-human suffering. And then by accessing more on a more daily basis the self, then you can be exposed to more spiritual states, and which can then be embodied as well. So all of those would help increase to some extent a person's depth. And then finally, the cultural code, which is a person's values and worldviews, this can be helped by IFS through simply the process of the healing process of ISF helps relax extreme protectors with their burdens, a burden being an extreme emotional or belief. So as these extreme protectors are released of their burdens and the exiles also of their burdens, then this can open up a person's system, help it relax, and then thus become more open to their own vulnerability, to the vulnerability of others, and thus be more open to more universal and solidaric cultural codes, which tend to be later on in the sequence of cultural code stage development. And one other way in which cultural code IFS can help cultural code is through what IFS calls cultural legacy burdens. So we have, according to IFS, that you have individual burdens through our own life experiences, legacy burdens which come from our family and ancestors, and then cultural legacy burdens which come from kind of beliefs that are taken in from the culture in which we live. And IFS points, for example, to the United States, although this can apply to many other countries. Schwartz and Richard Schwartz and Martha Sweezy in their recent second edition of Internal Family Systems Therapy talk of four major cultural legacy burdens of the United States, which is racism, patriarchy, individualism, and materialism. And there are many others as well, but they point to those four. And so by being aware of these cultural legacy burdens and working on them, then we can gradually help release them and the cultural code to which they belong, and thus more able to move to a later cultural code. So that's one way to promote individual psychospiritual flourishing and development. For the collective level, then I'll very briefly discuss and compare two political programs or manifestos which are designed to promote collective flourishing and development. One is Hanzi Freinacht's Nordic ideology, and the other is Michael Lerner's Revolutionary Love. And they aim to move us towards a listening society, Freinacht's term, or a caring society, Michael Lerner's term. And these are different names for moving towards a eudaimonistic society or going to a post-postmodern or metamodern society. So they come at this from very different angles, mainly because Freinacht is focusing on Nordic countries and Lerner is focusing on the United States. And the Nordic countries are more socially developed. And so Freinacht focuses on moving from a green social liberalism, which is where Nordic countries are at the moment, to a green social liberalism 2.0. And it's rooted in a strong developmental perspective, just like the listening society, which is where Freinacht's psychological model was outlined. And so it has a developmental sociology which corresponds to its developmental psychology, which was outlined in listening society. It revolves around 6 new forms of politics, which are designed to enhance individual and social transformation, especially the first 3 forms. And then the next 3 forms are more designed to monitor and to check for any forms of oppression that may emerge from the first 3 forms. So the first 3 forms are, one of them is called democratization politics, which is focused on increasing the democratic nature of political institutions. So that would correspond in integral theory terms to the lower right quadrant. Then there's the Gemeinschaft politics, which is focused on the community we space, which is related to the lower left quadrant in integral theory terms, and is aimed at improving general social relationships and gaining greater trust between people. Then there's existential politics, which corresponds to integral theory's upper left quadrant, and that's based on promoting individual psychospiritual flourishing and development. And then the other 3 forms of politics, as I said, was designed to check for any forms of oppression that might arise from the first 3. So for example, there is empirical politics, which makes sure that any policies are based on the best science available. Emancipatory politics, which again makes sure that any policies which affect a person's more intimate life do not become too oppressive. And the final one is the politics of theory, which basically is designed to bring all the worldviews currently existing to the fore, make them transparent, and place them under democratic scrutiny. So it's a theoretically very elegant model, just like its 4-part psychological model. And with each of the new forms of politics balancing out and checking against the others, and as Freinacht puts it, it's similar to it's kind of a Montesquieu 2.0, which has the separation of powers now involves 6 forms of politics which balance each other and check each other out. It's a stage-based political program, focusing more on cognitive complexity and worldview, cultural code, more than on on states and depth, although that's involved as well, but it tends towards more of a stage-based approach. And we could say that using Freinacht's own distinction between darker versions of value means and lighter versions, darker meaning more focused on the stage components, cognitive complexity and cultural code, and lighter, more focused on the state and depth components. Then we could say it's more that Freinacht's political program is a darker version of metamodernism, whereas Michael Lerner's political manifesto, it could be said to be a more lighter version. It's not explicit of metamodernism. It's not explicitly metamodernism, but it's a postmodernism attempt to move beyond both modernity and postmodernity. And so in that sense, it can be also considered a metamodernist program. So yeah, it's more heart-based and more passionate and more based on depth, contacting deeper yearnings and more spiritual yearnings. So it's not focused. It's focused on the United States, which is has much greater levels of social equality and social injustice, and is not as socially advanced as the Nordic countries, and as a result it requires a bit more radical strategy, which is based on undoing or transforming the social structures and institutions that are acting as constraints on psychospiritual flourishing and development. It calls it a spiritual. So Michael Lerner calls it spiritual socialism, or socialism of the heart, or post-socialism. And it's very much in line with the spiritual progressive politics, for example, with the nonviolent politics of Gandhi, Martin Luther King, and Abraham Joshua Heschel, or, for example, with liberation theology, or more radical Christians like Cornel West, or even we could point to Noam Chomsky's, although Chomsky's position is a much more secular based, but it kind of Chomsky's position resonates to some extent with the prophetic tradition of radical critique of social injustice and speaking truth to power. So we could put Chomsky in that line as well. So while Freinacht's model is rooted especially in the six new forms of politics, Lerner's is based on a new bottom line. So moving from the old bottom line of everything, all institutions and social structures being judged according to the bottom line of how much money and power they create. The new bottom line of Michael Lerner is based on to what extent does each institution and structure lead to psychospiritual flourishing. So what I like to do just before concluding is to read out Michael Lerner's description of the new bottom line, which may appear utopian, but it's based in deep structures and in underlying desires and fundamental needs, which are lying just below the surface. So it is a kind of concrete utopianism, not just abstract utopianism. So I'll just read it out. So this new bottom line of Michael Lerner's is one that judges our institutions, our economy, our political lives, our legal system, our cultural institutions, our educational system, and every aspect of our society as productive, efficient, or rational, to the extent that they maximize our human capacities to be loving, generous, and caring towards each other and toward the earth, ethically and environmentally responsible, and committed to social, economic, and environmental justice, and to the extent to which they promote joy, playfulness, compassion and empathy, self-acceptance, humor and aesthetic creativity, health and thanksgiving for life in all its forms, love of learning, science and literature, repentance and forgiveness, treatment of all human beings as embodiments of the sacred and not just instrumentally as means to our own ends, and a response to our universe and our planet Earth that is filled with awe, wonder, and radical amazement. So, to reach such a relative utopia will require both a shift in consciousness and a corresponding transformation of social structures and institutions. And this in turn will require a mass shedding of negative cultural narratives and cultural legacy burdens, a shift in our view of ourselves and others and the world, and also the building of alternative ways of living, such as, for example, the construction of a network of mutual aid communities, which are beginning to sprout, boosted by the pandemic. And to do all this, this decade and the next will be crucial. So our current crisis and period of transition is fraught with danger, and the stakes are very high. There's a temptation to cling on to the status quo and to deny the transcendent moment that we're living through. And also there's the danger of that the more fearful and destructive parts of ourselves and society can gain a hold. The other alternative is to make a conscious decision to, first of all, to take hold of hope and to make a conscious decision to become midwives for a new form of consciousness in ourselves and others, and to create, to bring forth a more caring form of social organization that's pushing to be born, and allowing our more constructive and creative and courageous and caring parts of ourselves to take the helm. The former will lead to regression and possibly collapse, but the latter will enable us to move forward towards a more listening or caring or eudaimonistic society. Thank you for listening.